And now it's my great pleasure to invite Philip, and I know for several years through correspondence. He was a student in Cyprus, and he did his master thesis on ecumenical.
Bachelor thesis.
It's a bachelor thesis. Yeah, yeah. Bachelor thesis of Saint Justin ecumenism. He uploaded this to academia, and I immediately contacted him, and it's 3 years now.
3 years, yeah. 3 years ago.
Yeah, and when we decided to organize a conference, I immediately had Philip in mind to invite him and to share, because he speaks also Serbian. He learned in the meantime, and has this experience of living in the West and being somebody who accepted the legacy of Father Justin. Philip Calington is at the moment a PhD student at St. Sergius Theological Institute in Paris, and he's going to give us a paper on reception and importance on St. Justin and his works among converts in the West.
Thank you, and Mr. Setkovic, thank you for inviting me and keeping me in your mind when you organize this very nice conference. Christos Vaskrese. So how do I follow up so many brilliant presentations, especially the last one where the discussion lasted equally as long as the presentation? Well, today I will actually speak to you about something a bit different than most of the brilliant presentations these past 2 days. My short talk is nothing that I would call real academic study as such, as most have been at least. Rather, actually, I will speak about St. Justin and his teachings in a bit of a different context, a personal context, if you wish. And the context is that of a convert to the faith in the West, and when I mean West now, I mean locally in the West, converts in the West, and why St. Justin is and can be appealing to potential converts in the West, or people that have already converted, why he is appealing. So I studied at a Jesuit university where I did my bachelor, and that's actually where I discovered St. Justin and decided to do my bachelor on him. This later led me, of course, to accept Orthodoxy and become Orthodox. So I can say that it was a lot thanks to St. Justin. So when a future convert like myself, being born and raised Roman Catholic, first starts to explore Orthodoxy, usually one would encounter a lot of negativity towards Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, everything that is not Orthodox. This, of course, is not strange, as most of this criticism is based on the fact that the West departed from the true Orthodox faith, the Orthodox would say, from their perspective. A critique of extreme rationalism, scholasticism, and so forth is usually found, very easy to find among Orthodox saints and Orthodox theologians. If we think of the 20th century, at least to my mind, comes two people that in the West, and especially among converts, have had widespread and have been accepted among converts. In the States, I would want to mention Father Seraphim Rose, who I think many in Serbia and especially in Russia are aware of. He's very much recognized as a very harsh critic of Western Christianity, nihilism, humanism, ecumenism, and so forth, very much like St. Justin. You could almost think they knew each other. Of course, there are many more theologians, but remember, I am here speaking about the context of converts in the West, meaning they usually don't know Greek, don't know Russian, don't know Serbian, so that's why I'm very limited. We are very limited in the West who we can read of all these newer theologians. Likewise, the translated works of St. Justin, the few, I might add, because very few of his works have actually been translated into English. This is something we must keep in mind as well. They're also very much appreciated in the West. And not only in America, but also in Western Europe, where I'm from. I mean, I live in Sweden, but ideologically we would say Western Europe. And also even I visited Japan for a conference a few weeks ago where I presented a paper on St. Justin. And actually many Japanese converts to Orthodoxy knew who he was right away. They liked him very much, they liked his writings, they knew his writings deeply, and they venerated him as a saint, even having an icon of him in their cathedral in Tokyo, which just gives you you know, a new perspective being in Belgrade, speaking about St. Houston, that people in Japan have an icon of him in the cathedral. So, to get to the point, why is or can St. Houston be so appealing to converts? This is basically the topic of my talk. And I will here try to summarize it very shortly in 4 points, which I think best underline what aspects of his teachings and why these teachings are appealing to converts in the West. I will not try to go in depth on any one of these points, because honestly, in the last 2 days, everyone has explored some parts of them. I will just highlight them to you as a convert and tell you why they are appealing. So the first one, which I want to highlight, is that St. Houston is intellectually pleasing and coherent. So many Orthodox saints, especially those that lived and wrote, let's say, before the 18th century, criticized Roman Catholicism very harshly. Overall, West very harshly. And this harsh way was perhaps not always articulated in such a manner so that a Westerner could truly understand it or try to engage with it. I read for once, for example, I will not say the name of the saint, it's not necessary, but I read a quote from a saint who was one of the patriarchs of Constantinople. And he wrote that, and excuse me now, but he wrote that Catholics would drink the urine of animals and that they would use icons in their toilets, for example, right? Now, I think we all can agree that that's not any teaching of the Catholic Church or something that we should criticize them for as a theological thing. And he said that they're heretics because they do it. So he used this to say that this is why they're heretics, because they drink urine of animals, which isn't very intellectually satisfying, at least for me. And so such critique, as I mentioned, is usually rejected by a potential convert very quickly as simple smearing or negative generalization, right? Nothing that truly explains why Catholics, or whoever we are talking about, might be heretics from a certain point of view. Here, however, St. Justin, very interestingly, while being a critique of rationalism of the West and their over-reliance on intellectual justification of various aspects of the faith, he also appeals to the very same rationalistic Westerners that he critiques. And I will explain to you. I'm by no means claiming that St. Houston was a rationalist. Please don't quote me on that. But his critique of the West is very intellectually pleasing. It satisfies, or at least challenges, the reason, in the same way I think that Dostoevsky does. You know, it's not just smearing and being negative. There is some depth to what he's actually saying. I think this is because, as we all know, St. Houston was a deep thinker. Very often when reading about him in the Western context, especially non-Orthodox Western context, you can just go to Wikipedia. The first thing he's referred to is a philosopher. Not a theologian, not a priest, not a monk, not a saint, a philosopher. That's very usually the first thing you read about him in a Western non-Orthodox context. I believe a good and short example of this intellectually pleasing arguments he uses is the claim that Protestants are all de facto papists. You know, while of course many of us might not agree with it, he clearly shows how the theory of papal supremacy or papism on a universal level is being applied on an individual level among some Protestants, mixed in of course with Übermensch, humanism, and so forth and so forth. So I remember when I did my bachelor studies at the Jesuit University, and my bachelor work, as I mentioned before, was about St. Houston. The Jesuits themselves, very nice people, while of course categorically disagreeing with St. Houston and his teachings. I mean, I would hope they do, being Catholics. Nevertheless, they really thought that his claims, and especially the one I mentioned about papism and Pope and the Protestants, and overall, nevertheless, they found him very interesting on an intellectual and a philosophical level. They disagreed, of course, but they saw the depth of his thoughts. They saw that they couldn't simply reject it as some Orthodox unintelligent zealotism, which is unfortunately very often the case in polemics between the Orthodox and the Western world overall. Is that many times the Orthodox are accused of being, that the Orthodox don't really understand, or haven't really involved intellectually as much as the West, etc., etc. Likewise, his sharp critique of humanism, St. Houston's that is, connecting it to the various ideologies of his time. We can speak about communism, fascism, Nazism, as well as and him finding traces of both communism and fascism in papism and ecumenism, he's truly equally in the West seen as a philosopher, as he is a theologian. That I already said, I'm sorry. And this thing that he's seen as a philosopher has also caused many people to be very critical of him in the West, because they only see him as a philosopher and only analyze him as a philosopher. For example, I have seen a PhD research proposal in Germany. I haven't followed up really, but I've seen a proposal that want to tie St. Justin to Serbian nationalism, connecting it to the Balkan Wars. So he's, you know, so for that reason, he's just not only seen as a religious figure, but he also is seen as so much more in the West. So just to summarize the first point, the intellectual depth and coherence of St. Justin's writings and arguments is something a Western seeker does find very appealing many times, because it shows to many Westerners that Orthodoxy can and does defend itself to a certain degree with reason, and in a way that in the West can be seen as intellectual, or intellectually pleasing, I should say. Even if one disagrees with him, I think it's very hard for anyone to simply claim that his arguments are not coherent or well articulated. The second point I want to bring up is that St. Justin, and this all of you of course know already, spoke the truth in love. This is something that we can see throughout all his writings, at least I think so. While he was very harsh, I think it's very important to remember that he always started with Christ and always ended with Christ. He always had the God-man in the middle of everything he did, as the center of his very existence, I would say. For example, while being Catholic before, I never felt that St. Justin attacked me as a believer, me as a person. Quite the opposite. His critique of the Roman Catholic Church is done, in my opinion, in such a way so that he rarely even mentions a single person. He rather speaks of their teachings or ideologies, or in the case of the Pope, about the institution of the papacy, why he sees it as wrong. Likewise, even when he critiques the Protestants for being their personal popes, or their small popes, you never get a sense that he's speaking about a person or even about a group of people. Rather, he's strictly referring to what he sees as a heresy that they have in his opinion. And in many cases, he does it in a very understanding way, where you can almost sense that he understands that they're truly born into this and they haven't really, chosen it per se. And I think he truly just wants to challenge people to think and to examine and to analyze, because he truly hates the sin, not the person. I think that's something that all saints, whether Western or Eastern, would say. You have to hate the sin, not the person, and this is what Christ taught. And just to go back, I believe that he shares this with Father Seraphim Rose. That's why they're so similar in many aspects. Too many people today involved in polemics, and especially if you look online, which you shouldn't on the internet, but if you unfortunately do, you will see that many people involved in polemics get very much affected emotionally, and they attack on an individual basis. They attack a person personally. St. Justin, being a man of prayer first and foremost, never did that. At least I haven't found anything where he attacks anyone personally. One never gets a feeling that he's in any way driven by emotions. For example, his dislike of Catholicism is not because Croats or Catholics. I haven't at least found that. He doesn't dislike Catholicism because Croats or Catholics, but rather strictly because he sees it as a heresy. He sees it as something that is against the truth, the faith, not the people. So, of course, he saw it as a duty to speak the truth, but to speak in love. The whole core of his worldview is based on the truth in love. To him, to love somebody, even your enemy, means to be truthful, such as the scriptures taught him to be and teaches us how to be. St. Justin said very famously that love lives by speaking the truth. This is also why he's so negative to what he sees as, of his time, the meaningless ecumenical movement, which he calls a dialogue of lies. Why? Because it doesn't have truth as its criteria, as he understood the ecumenical movement. But rather it tries to reach it tries to reach an agreement based on pseudo-love, he would say, and on and after the tradition of man, quoting the Bible. His whole critique of ecumenism is based on the fact that it doesn't have truth as its criteria. Truth can't be negotiated, as St. Eustace famously claimed. That's why he would see that ecumenism in the form that he critiques is useless, it's a lie, and it is a heresy, the pan-heresy as he calls it. Because of his view on what love and truth is, he always spoke the many times painful truth, for which he's been attacked many times as being a zealot, as being unloving. But I truly believe, and I truly found that he always spoke it with love for his neighbor. Sorry that I focus again on ecumenism too much, but it's an easy and clear example where I really believe that he speaks the painful truth in love. You know, he's not critiquing the people, but the bad thing they're doing. Now, the third thing I want to bring up is that St. Eustace is a universal teacher. He has sometimes been criticized for being a symbol of modern evil Serbian nationalism, you know. Something that he ties him together with St. Vladika Nikolai Velimirovic. It's very easy to find this online about those two. For example, terms like heavenly Serbia, which can be found in Serbian spiritual writings, when taken out of context, may ring many negative bells, especially in the West, and especially among people influenced by, what we would say, NATO propaganda or political propaganda. What St. Eustace, however, manages to do is to appeal to people of all nationalities. I have even heard personally, and know personally, of Croat Catholics who, once they actually read him, learn to appreciate him as a spiritual writer and philosopher, without, of course, having to agreeing with him. You know, it's not about agreeing, but they can at least read him in a neutral way and try to really see what he's talking about. And likewise, he's also very negative towards his own Serbia, very often and very harshly, showing he's not interested in defending a country or a nation, but rather to defending the truth. Examples is, for example, when he famously in his sermon on the 20th anniversary of the riposte of Vladika Nikolai screams out that the Serbs have crucified Saint Sava, he said. And then he cries out, there is no real Serbs left. Where are the Serbs? He asks. So he's also very critical of his own people, even more so probably than any other people that he criticizes, I would say. Now, St. Eustace's teachings, while he of course wrote them in his own context, they are very universal. In that way, I believe, personally, that he very much embodies how the church should be, which is universal. St. Eustace's time in the UK, Russia, Greece, his native Balkans, very much, I believe, made him well aware of other aspects and other contexts than his own Serbian one. For example, when he writes about Catholicism, it is as if he's truly seen it, or almost lived it, or next to it. You know, when I was a Catholic, I truly felt that some aspects, not all, but some aspects of his critique, he spoke as if he truly knew, you know, like as he truly understood it. And I truly believe this must have come especially from his time in the UK, where he spent many years and probably encountered many, both Anglicans, Protestants, Catholics, but also from his mentor, Vladika Nikolai, who, as we know, especially early in his life, was very active in ecumenical meetings and gatherings and preachings. And now the universalism of St. Eustace is sometimes sadly overlooked in today's scholarship. Some wonderful presentations here have touched upon it and highlighted some aspects of it, but I still believe that it is still not as widely spread as I believe it should be. St. Eustace is more than just the embodiment of Serbia and of Serbs. He's the embodiment of orthodoxy, which is universal at its core. The faith, the church is universal. While more and more of his works get translated into the Western languages, especially English, this awareness of his universality, of the universality of his views and teachings will be more accepted. This I deeply hope that we will get more and more translations. The last point I want to make is that St. Eustace is truly a patristic voice in the 20th century, which, again, many presentations here have touched upon. When engaging in orthodoxy for the first time, whatever your faith is, you know, we're always met with the fathers, you know, the church fathers. It's always like something that we all hear. And that's not always so easy to decipher. It's not always so easy to understand. St. Houston is an echo of the Church Fathers of the patristic age. While he himself is very often seen as a theologian that contributed to 20th century Orthodox and Christian theology, he is also truly an embodiment of Orthodox tradition, a tradition that is about receiving, keeping pure, and giving it to the next generation, about keeping the tradition alive. You know, Orthodox patristic theology is something that is alive, it should be alive. You know, when we pray in the Orthodox tradition, we always start Molitva Missiotis Rotis Nasce, you know, through the prayers of our Holy Fathers. You know, the Fathers are with us today, and their teachings are with us today, and they're relevant today as well as 1500 years ago. St. Houston, however, not simply retold the teachings of the Fathers as they were, he also showed us how to apply the spirit of these teachings in our modern world and to our modern issues. For example, many questions that we face today, the Fathers didn't address specifically. This is always an issue in patristic studies. But we often hear about this term, the spirit of the Fathers, you know, meaning that we have to try to figure out what they would think about a certain modern thing by looking at what they thought about similar things in their own time. So you might ask, why is it appealing for any Westerners that St. Houston is a modern church father? If one comes from the Roman Catholic Church, as I myself did, everything there is defined and explained, or most of it. All is systematic and explained, and very easy. It is very easy to get, you know, it is very easy to. I'm sorry, 1 second. It is very easy to get the position of the Vatican on most issues, on most questions, because that's how they work. Now, I'm of course not claiming that St. Houston's theology should be compared to the systematic theology of the Latins, but he nevertheless speaks with authority and is often by many today de facto called a church father. I don't know if you've heard it, but I've heard it many times, especially in spiritual circles, St. Houston being referred to, he's being equally put it to the level of the church fathers. Or sorry, modern church father, they would say, of course. And again, we can very simply look at the heresy of ecumenism, which, you know, for St. Houston, which he rejected, of course, in the modern and humanistic form that he saw it as during his time. This issue the fathers didn't address specifically in details. We can agree on that. They didn't have the same context as we have. But I truly believe that his positions in that question and many other questions are truly based on the fathers and on the spirit of the fathers, as we say. Therefore, St. Houston offers a steady point for many converts when they come into the Orthodox faith. He becomes like a rock, like a solid point to focus on. So often when entering the Orthodox Church or engaging with it, one is met by many various views, backed by many different theologians, quoting church fathers here, left and right, and everyone has an opinion, and we don't have an infallible pope to say what's right or wrong. So you're often met with that. Now, to find our way in this clutter, so to speak, is very hard, and I really believe that St. Houston offers guidance, and this guidance we can almost touch because he lived just a few decades ago. You know, he's a very relative thing for us. We can relate to him, we can see pictures of him, we can meet people like his spiritual daughter, who's the igumenia of the monastery. You know, he's here, he's basically here. So he's truly been the voice of the fathers, and this is something that many converts need and long for when they come to Orthodoxy, because there isn't this other thing that they could easily turn to, and he's truly appealing to converts in that sense. He's an authority that converts need. And just to finish off some last thoughts, so much of St. Houston is very often presented as in opposition to everything that's Western. And when I mean Western now, I'm talking more about not geographically, but Western, because I believe Houston would say that Serbia today is Western, you know, with more abortions than any place in the world, and gay parades, and, you know, whatever. He would claim this is equally as much as West as New York is. But either way, very often he's presented as in opposition to the West only, and this is of course true in many aspects, as he is a sharp critic of the Western ideologies and so forth. It is, however, important, in my opinion, to strongly emphasize that St. Houston can't and shouldn't only be viewed as a negative quote machine against Catholics or Protestants, because we must embrace him as a universal teacher of the same people that he actually criticizes. You know, he's not excluding anyone. St. Houston is not an embodiment, in my opinion, of anti-Western thought or anti-Catholic or Protestant thought. He's so much more, and his critique is actually what, yeah, today it's perhaps best known in the West because due to our context. But again, like I said, he's so much more than that on all levels, both spiritually and intellectually. If we just isolate him to speak about what's bad in the West, I truly believe that we'll lose who he really was. Nevertheless, his critique is vital, and in the same way as Christ was in the midst of sinners he didn't agree with, because as he said, the healthy don't need a doctor, as Christ tells us. Likewise, St. Houston is a medicine that many in the West, and again in West we could probably say the whole civilized world today, it's a person that St. Houston is very much needed. He truly was someone who made me and many other converts, I personally know other seminarians who I study with, to wake up and examine our faiths. Like Father Peter here, a famous convert in America, said he calls St. Houston's writings salvific in their nature. That's how Father Peter hears. He calls St. Houston's writings salvific in their nature because they're so very important when we come from that Western context. Today, when political correctness has penetrated deep into our societies and even our churches, St. Houston, together with other holy teachers of the 20th century, truly stands as beacons we must cling on to and follow, or at least not ignore. We can't be indifferent about them. I believe that if we are, and if we go the other way, we will surely be led to spiritual death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Now, questions? Professor Brammer, Father Stephen.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is about your saying that you mentioned the proposal for the doctoral thesis and Justin being shown or projected in the West as nationalist and so on. And I agree, of course, that we cannot find so much nationalistic and so on. But we heard this morning in this room there were two lecturers who spoke about Justin, and one, the last, I don't know who was here, but the last slide of the man from the library, he talked about his theological work and about his writings on Dostoevsky, and then he switched without saying it, but it was, he started to speak about the Serbian nation and how the Serbian nation received him later and did not, and so on. So this man was not Western. Yeah. And the other one also who spoke about the disciples, he took his start point was theological, and then he turned into, so it's not, I would say it's not only a Western thing, it's very common here. And people like you and me and people in the West who read him say, we don't have a problem, but people here make a problem, so some people here make a problem.
I think you can ask a question. I just want to, I think you misunderstood me. I meant that in the West we are taught that here he is nationalistic, so I would agree with you. I probably wasn't clear enough. I just meant, I definitely agree, and that's something that's very bad. So
good. And the question I have, it's, you gave a personal witness, so I hope I will not come too closer to that. But the point is, you spoke about the appeal which Justin and his work may have for people in the West, and for people who might consider to convert, or reading him, they might convert eventually. And first, I have the experience of people, for example, in Germany, my country, who convert to Orthodoxy. It's much more because of most people actually who convert to Orthodoxy in Germany do it, interestingly enough, to the Russians, not to the Greeks and not to the Serbs or Romanians, but to the Russians. And then you have like the liturgy, icons, that is something. And it's a question of experience. I must add, most people convert because they marry someone. It's not because of individual, but it's because of a family issue. But a part of that, it's people who have an experience, a liturgical experience, a prayer experience, and so on. Your presentation was very rational. You brought reasons, rational reasons. You brought, he's not translated, or he translation. So it's about, you spoke about study and aspects of teaching and so on. So it's a very rational approach you showed us today about someone who criticizes the rational approach of the West. So that is my, it's a kind of contradiction, so to say.
And that's really what I try to get at, because that's the whole thing with St. Houston. That while he criticizes the West, so to speak, right? I think that those that truly study him and try to study him, at least what's available, their reason will be satisfied. Like he's not, while he criticizes aspects of it, I don't believe he's completely opposed to it, and that's why he's intellectually appealing and coherent. He's very coherent. I mean, also my context is very much, academic and with seminarians who have converted, so I should have maybe pointed that out. But I mean, for example, I know 3-4 seminarians in America who study now to be priests, and they're very much all in on St. Houston, exactly for these reasons, because maybe they were Catholics and they're looking for something to satisfy that thirst for knowledge, that intellectual knowledge. So I think that very often within Orthodoxy we are sometimes extremely negative to everything that the Catholics do just because they're Catholics, right? While we actually, for example, when you read, yes, when we read the Cappadocian Fathers, for example, I mean, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, I mean, he's borderline a philosopher sometimes, I mean, we shouldn't just make it black and white, and I truly believe that Saint Houston can appeal to, like I said, even Jesuits who I know personally, who really, oh yeah, I don't agree, but this is actually philosophy. I can actually analyze it. We can do something, So yeah. So.
Father Stephen, and then Bogdan and Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It's easy to understand, if I listen to you, why the converts you mentioned find authority in the way in which St. Justin reads Scripture, reads the Church Fathers. I was surprised at the very beginning that you seem to imply that the writings of a recent convert in the 1960s in San Francisco could be almost equally appealing to these young converts, because the writings of this gentleman are, of course, well known and for me difficult sometimes, but they cannot be compared to St. Justin. It's a totally different level of depth, of learning, of maturity, of asceticism, and everything that you will. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only reason why I would mention them in the same breath is that Father Seraphim Rose wrote everything in English. So all his works is available, while St. Houston is very little available. So I more wanted to show that Father Seraphim very much wrote in the spirit of St. Houston in some aspects, and they would agree on a lot of things. But I just want to mention someone who also was meaningful apart from St. Houston, and and many people in the church want him canonized, Father Seraphim, and they're of course we might disagree about him, but to compare, I mean, I didn't do it as a comparison and to mean that they're both equally the same. They're different, but their writings, or perhaps the writings translated into English by St. Houston, are very comparable to what Father Seraphim Rose was writing, especially about ecumenism and especially about nihilism and humanism. I think you can very much see that they are part of the same larger tradition in that sense, I would at least. But of course I agree that St. Houston is another level.
At some later date, it would be nice to have some brilliant person do a synthesis of the phronema, the mindset of Western Europe today, because so much of what St. Justin says is useful to understand, and the current period, but it was prophetic in his day. The Enlightenment is dead. Hierarchy of values are disintegrated, etc., etc., etc. And it would be very interesting to bring forward these prophetic and profound statements.
Yes, and like you said, Father Houston was prophetic, while Saint Houston was prophetic, while Father Seraphim more wrote about his experience of what Saint Houston prophesied. So that's why I find a connection between both of them, because one spoke about what will happen, and the other actually said, look, this happened, and now how can we solve it?
Thank you. You've raised many points, and I found your paper extremely useful, because it's very rarely the case that we can hear somebody who's deeply within the teachings of Father Justin Popovich as, I don't like the word at all, but just technically as a convert from the West. But I don't like the word at all, but that's me.
That's the truth.
That's not me. I'd like to just briefly reflect on three things, and I'd like to commend you for all three. Actually, the first is, well, I'd rather, I don't know if I can say, I'd rather correct what you and Professor Thomas Bremer agreed upon in terms of whether the Serbs in-read nationalism into Father Justin's works, or is it vice versa, and what is the role of the Western reception or media rather than theologically serious people? Actually, I think it's all together. You can't say it's just Serbs switching into a quasi-nationalist narrative or point of reference, which happens. Nor can we just say that the West are projecting stuff from outside without instigation from Serbs who are doing it, as previously said. It's like a circle which feeds itself. It's like an alternating current. So I think they feed each other, you know, serving separate goals, but for separate. They work together, but they are for separate goals. Yeah. So I think that's really where the truth is. But the most important is what you've said. He's above chauvinism and even nationalism without a correction from the ecclesiological Christ or the God-man, as Professor Thomas Bremer brilliantly and you very elegantly have reminded all of us together. And even I'd like to add that even if we hear these things 1,000 times over, it's always good to hear it another 1,000th time over and again, because there's something in the nature of the structure of this fallenness, which we call state history, diplomatic and non-diplomatic, various relations of ours, which is infected by this proclivity to swap our sin for what God is giving us through the church. And he has a illuminated and pure, clear mind with the diakrisis, which Father Stephen referred to, and I'm thankful. It was not one to pollute. The second point I'd like to make is that I very much like your observation about Father Justin's theological discourse being actually very rational. I'd say even disciplined and coherent in the effort of thinking reason to be methodically disciplined. In the book Justin Popovich in Russia, I ventured to call for correction as regards Aristotelos Papanikolaos, who in his study Reasonable Faith and Trinitarian Logic, which was published in Hemmings and Parsons' Restoring Faith in Reason in 2002, says that in Father Justin Popovich, I quote, "There's a rhetoric of anti-intellectualism," and then he goes on to say, "This is an extreme position," and then he compounds him with Christos Yannaras as two starkly anti-Western, anti-intellectualist, neo-patristic philosophers, which shouldn't be the case, the model case in orthodoxy. And I argued in writing that actually, this is my point. I put it this way: rationality or reason which are not aware of their limits are irrational. It's not a rational thing to absolutize reason. Father Justin knows this, but it's paradoxical that the German tradition of philosophical idealism teaches this brilliantly. I mean, even in Kant already, Verstand and Vernunft are not the same. Hegel takes it to a philosophy in its own right. But this comes out of Father Justin's awareness that reason can be enlightened or not by having or not having the knowledge and experience of grace. In other words, it is a diakrisis logike, a diakrisis dianoia, illuminated reason which is critiquing a reason which is self-referential. And this, it was very puzzling to me how such an astute mind as our colleague Aristoteles missed this and even went as far. And then I added that actually all of this then more comes out of his systematic grounding of a philosophy of logosality, of logosness. And rationality is one, not the only aspects of a logosality of the mind in the most eminent sense of the word. And super quickly, I very much love, may I steal it from you? He's not a quoting machine against the West. I'll steal it if you allow.
Yeah, please.
Because there's so much more, really.
Yeah.
There's so much more. Thank you for noticing that and for transferring. Sorry if I've labored this too much.
And Father Ljubisha, and you can just a quick questions, and Philip will answer then.
I'll try.
Together. Okay, yeah.
And I would like to say something about nationalism and Saint Justin, and to thank you about your paper, who helps us to understand how all converts receive the Orthodox, the Saint Justin, etc. You have mentioned that about the poem Heavenly Serbia. It is very we know about that, and we have to know that that poem, the Heavenly Serbia, we need to understand in the context of in the liturgical context and eschatological context. Without these two contexts, we can see nationalism and all other bad things, I would say. The second point I want to speak, it is just a moment to find the right word. Okay. Sorry, other time. I just want to underline only on the Heavenly Serbia that we need to understand in that two contexts.
Yeah. And I agree, and that's why I mentioned it only that from those outside it is used as something to show that it's bad, but like you just mentioned, it should be seen in the right, like Svятая Rus, you have the same thing in America today, if you mention Holy Russia, they will think about Putin. So I mean, unfortunately everything is a bit strange. So, yeah.
Just, I remember. When we are talking about nationalism and Saint Justin, we can someone can say that he criticized very often West, Catholics, Papa, etc., etc. But we have to have on our mind that more usually and more often Saint Justin criticized Serbs, and if someone who could have not known that Saint Justin is Serbian and reads all things against Serb, he could understand that Saint Justin is the enemy of Serbs.
Yes.
Saint Joseph from Zagreb.
Yeah. Exactly. So I would like to point.
Forgive me for a rude.
Yeah, no.
Joke, it wasn't from a.
That's I completely agree.
Okay, a quick, short. As much as
No, please do.
Just two short things for your paper. I think you should also look for the interest in converse. That there's a PhD student from USA wrote an online article on public orthodoxy where he uses Max Scheler to distinguish three types of religious thinkers, which also I think applies for converts. Where he there was in the draft of my paper here that was supposed to compare Seraphim Rose and Saint Houston, and he in the three categories he uses the resurrected, the apostates, and the romantics. And I think Saint Houston, and he says that the resurrected are the ones who truly experience the true transformation of faith, which I think Saint Houston was a clear example of. But somebody like Seraphim Rose, I think, according to this this scheme of Max Scheler, he would go either to the apostate, where apostate means somebody, because he converts, looks for uses his new found faith, new tradition to legitimize his own conversion. Yeah. So maybe you could find that interesting in your own own paper. And another thing, the recent I guess interest in the West for connecting Saint Houston with nationalism, I think it's much more prosaic because of the liberal slant in institutions who finance PhDs. It's much easier to get a doctorate funded when you have a team that is more provocative and which traces a certain religious figure to something horrible that's happened.
I agree, and that's why I'm not doing my PhD in Sweden but in France. So exactly because of that.
Well, I don't know. I have still, but the coffee is ready. I don't know what. A minute, 2 minutes. Now you can take the coffee and return, or technical. Father Stephen, yes, super fast.
15 seconds. Someone should deal with the popularity, especially in America, of esoteric ecumenism and give a response out of St. Justin, because it's a very subversive and very, very nasty way of exploiting the purity of the Christian faith to one's own ends.
I just wanted to ask Nevin, how does this come out of shadow?
Okay, let's just thank Philip. Thank you very much.